Do you need to begin every reply to the opponent's question by saying, Madam Opponent? No, you don't. Here are a few tips on how to address your opponent during the examination and how to provide great answers to the opponent's questions. First of all, agree with your opponent beforehand on how you should address them and which title they would like for you to use. Also, you and the custos can discuss in advance the examination's degree of formality. The participants don't have to resort to pre-formulated modes of expression all through the examination. For example, the opponent in my public defense was a professor from the United States. Those who teach at the university in the United States is referred to as professors, even if they're not doctors. And for this reason, my opponent preferred that I call him Dr. Rollins rather than Professor Rollins. Even though we refer to the event as public defense, it doesn't mean that you argue with the opponent. Rather, a candidate will defend the claims made in the doctoral dissertation. By that I mean that the candidate and the opponent will have a discussion during which the opponent will give their prepared remarks and challenge the methods or the findings of the thesis and ask questions about the candidate and their choices. And the candidate will then provide grounds for these choices. Furthermore, you should note that your opponent's questions do not always indicate that they disagree with you. Therefore, there's no need to panic or think of the situation as confrontation. Sometimes opponents ask certain questions to help those listeners who have not necessarily read the dissertation to keep up with the terminology and to guide the examination in a logical direction, or to make the lengthy conversation interesting. Your interpretations are important for your own experience. If you feel that you're constantly having to cope with and defend yourself against attacks, it will affect your experience of your examination. You must decide how you're going to interpret the other person's communication. And I do recommend that you choose to react to your opponent's questions with interest and be glad to answer them. The audience will also find it more enjoyable to follow the proceedings without an unnecessary sense of attacking and defending involved. Making critical observations is one of the cornerstones of science, and a public examination is a fine example of this. At its best, a dissertation helps all parties involved gain new realizations, theoretical formulations, and ideas for future research. The most important skill you will need during your public defense is active listening. And this means that as a listener, you will receive and carefully interpret the messages directed at you, understand their meaning, know how to connect these meanings to the knowledge you possess, know how to appropriately structure the information pertaining to the questions, and being able to answer them in a sufficient detail. Ensuring the coherent structure and suitable length of your answer is a vital skill. Your opponent's questions may be complex, and several options for answers may circulate your mind, and therefore you should listen and take time before answering. So what kind of questions can your opponent ask? The interaction between a candidate and the opponent typically begins with a set of warm-up questions. Your opponent will want to establish the context. How did you become interested in this topic? Why did you select this particular cover? Why did you choose the particular title? You should note that some of the questions that your opponent asks you are for the benefit of the members of the audience, so that they can get a clear picture of what it means to conduct research and gain some interesting and personal details of you as a candidate too. And this is what a good opponent does, so that the audience can enjoy watching the debate for several hours. Other commonly asked questions include, you could have used a number of methods to conduct this research. Why did you choose the ones that you did? Or, The chapter on the results gives a comprehensive view of the findings. Which ones do you personally think are the most significant and why? Or, if you were to write the dissertation again, what would you do differently? Or, what do you plan to do next in terms of research? No one expects you to come up with answers in a heartbeat. So take your time. The audience will find it interesting as well to watch you ponder the questions. You should also have paper handy because opponents' questions may consist of several sub-questions, include explanations as to why the opponent is asking a particular question, or have other elements that have no direct contact with the original question. Draw or write down terms and ideas, words that you can return to when formulating your answer. And in addition to this, you can always request a clarification or make sure that you have understood the question correctly. If conducting research was easy and the questions straightforward, anyone could do it. But you and your opponent have delved deeply into specific themes, which makes them complex. You're allowed to process when answering. However, try to pause to think rather than frantically jumping from one thought to the next. Not providing an answer immediately does not mean that you don't have one. The objective is to convince the opponent and the audience that you know how to do research, you know how to argue your point, and generate knowledge. We sometimes repeat words when trying to use more formal language, like this. I wanted to combine and to create different solutions, and the repetition is caused by our attempt to sound knowledgeable and playing for time. But if it becomes a mannerism, it can be tiring for the audience. Therefore, try not to repeat words and instead collect your thoughts and do not hesitate to take natural breaks. Furthermore, always direct your words at someone, which makes your reply more conversational. Your word choices will also be better suited for you when you do that. The same also applies to your posture. It is good if you can relax and not feel pressure during your examination, but do not let it affect your posture. Do not casually lean back in your chair and, worse still, rest your arm on the back of a chair. In fact, you should do the opposite and turn to face your opponent and lean towards them, as this will create the impression that you're actively listening and interacting with them. Furthermore, when answering questions, vary your opening lines and use adjectives. You can use adjectives to influence the mood, influence the opponent's view, and guide the emotions in the audience. Adjectives can also light your own fire. Therefore, you should rehearse out loud. Take advantage of your own expertise and ability to view things critically. Be your own opponent before your public examination. Anticipate the questions you might be asked and try out different answers. Brief, humorous remarks are also permitted, smiling is encouraged, and carefully communicated, good humored self irony will spice up the interaction at times. Below are a few options for opening lines. Madam Opponent, you have raised an interesting question. Thank you. This is a truly relevant observation. As the professor already noted, the practical solution of the research are: as my honorable opponent pointed out, the weaknesses of my study is a small number of interviewees. However, I believe that my target group is marginal, and that's why it's a merit, because no previous study has managed to reach this particular group. Thank you, Mr. Hawk, for your observation. However, I think that I'm particularly pleased to discuss this part of my research. Thank you. My aim here was to... Dr. Chow, this is a great point, and I would love to elaborate on that. You don't have to agree, with your opponent at all times, and you're also allowed to ask your opponent questions. However, your questions should mainly be limited to the following. Madam Opponent, would you mind repeating the question, please? Or, does the honorable opponent mean that don't ask your opponent how they would have done something or what the opponent's preferred solution to a problem would be. If your opponent points out an error in a table or a graph, acknowledge it. To err is human. Furthermore, if your opponent asks you a question that you cannot answer, it is better to admit it than to circle around the subject sounding ambiguous. If this happens, you can admit that the opponent's question was challenging and that unfortunately you cannot at that time provide an exhaustive answer. However, try to direct the discussion towards themes that are connected to that theme, but in which you have made some valuable contributions. The purpose of a public examination is to answer any questions that the readers of your work may have. And public proceedings allow you to defend your dissertation, and it will not be disputed later on since it has already been approved based on your defense. Finally, I would like to make 3 special observations. These are intended for those who are writing their dissertation as part of a research group. Think of ways in which you can clearly acknowledge the contribution of others in your group during your defense. You must only make claims that are truthful. If you conducted your research as part of a larger group of researchers with large quantities of data on which several doctoral dissertations will be or have been based, I would recommend that you spend some time considering your choice of words, starting with the pronouns. When should you say, I analyzed? And when should it be, we began to investigate? You and other members of your research team have co-published the work, which means that you should give credit to your entire team. Remember, however, that your findings are your findings, even if you write your doctoral dissertation as part of a research team. Don't be too modest. Without your contributions, these findings would not be available now. Therefore, plan ahead the type of recognition you wish to give to other members of your team and to yourself as the author of your dissertation. Make concrete preparations by writing down notes in your own thesis before your defense. You can also use colorful stickers to mark chapters or articles in your thesis so that you can quickly find the ones you need. Make sure that you have some paper and at least 2 pens in front of you in case one of them lets you down during the examination. Write down what you can when your opponent is asking you questions. You can also note down thoughts, ideas, concepts, terms, or findings that you want to remember to mention before your opponent declares that they are ready to give their final statement. And finally, try to relax as quickly as possible during the examination. The purpose of the opponent's initial questions is to help you do this by asking about themes that you will find easy to answer. For example, I wanted to study this topic because I was working as a teacher and became interested in finding out the pupils' experiences about group work. Countless people have said that after about an hour and a half, they peaked and would have loved to continue their public defense for at least another hour and a half. Yet, the examination may be concluded sooner than you think. And for this reason, watch my video on managing performance anxiety and tips from peers for the day.